Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sadia Zafar from HRAI. I would like to welcome you to today's session on humidity control done right. Our presenter, Nicholas Lee from Condair, will talk to you about the link between humidity and health, as well as best practices for mitigating dry indoor environments, primarily in commercial buildings. A little bit of housekeeping. You will notice on the control panel of your screen the Q&A feature. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions at any time during the webinar. They will be addressed at the end of the session. Also note, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared with you following the session. Now we welcome Nicholas.
Great, thank you, Sadia, and welcome everyone to our webinar today. As Sadia mentioned, today we're going to discuss some of the aspects related to humidity control, particularly in commercial buildings, as well as a little bit of industrial. But certainly a lot of what we're discussing today can also be applied to residential settings as well, in particularly when we talk a little bit later about some of the health aspects of humidity. Before I get started, a few acknowledgements and biases. First, I wanted to just acknowledge some of the content that you'll see today was contributed by a ASHRAE Technical Committee 511, the Humidifiers Committee, which I'm currently a part of, as well as a couple individuals, Eric Brodsky, Dr. Stephanie Taylor, and the AHRI, which is the sister organization for HRAI, the Humidifier Educational Working Group there, which I'm also a part of. One thing to be aware of for the presentation, I am currently employed by a manufacturer of humidity control equipment that does provide a good advantage and a good opportunity for me to work with humidity day in, day out, but just something to keep in mind as you go through the content. Today, we're going to talk about a few different topics. We'll start first and foremost with the definition of humidity and talk a little bit about how we measure it. We'll branch into then why buildings are getting dry after that and where some of this dryness is coming from. We'll talk briefly about dryness in manufacturing processes, industrial processes, as that's useful for some of the information later on. We'll spend a lot of the presentation today on talking about dryness in people and the occupants in our building and what exactly this problem of dryness means. Bit about humidity research, and then we'll get into some more practical humidity control tips and topics for our buildings. First and foremost, let's talk about how we measure humidity. When we're talking about humidity in buildings or in the air in general, there's really two different terms that we're focused on. The first is the absolute humidity, and the absolute humidity is measured as a mass of water in a mass of air. So if you think about this, if we were to take our volume of air and wring out all of the water and then measure the mass of that water, that would be the absolute humidity in the air. And typically you'll see that quoted in either grains per pound or grams per kilogram. The other and the more common way that we talk about humidity is relative humidity. And relative humidity is simply expressed as a percentage. 0% relative humidity means there's absolutely no moisture in the air. 100% relative humidity means that the air can't actually hold any more moisture in it. And something in the middle, 50%, for example, would suggest that we have about half of the humidity that the air can hold. Now, one very interesting thing about relative humidity is that the amount of water the air can hold is actually dictated by the temperature. So if we take a simple example here to illustrate this, if we have a mass of air, say we have 1 pound of air or half a kilogram, and it's relatively cold, we'll say about 2 degrees centigrade, 35 Fahrenheit, and fully saturated. So this air is 100% relative humidity. It can't hold any more moisture inside the air. Any additional moisture after this point would exist as a fog or a cloud of particles that do not actually evaporate. So this corresponds to about 30 grains per pound or about 2 grams per kilogram. If we do nothing to this air other than apply some heat to it, so we increase the temperature only, and we take our same 1 pound, half a kilogram of air, and we bring that up to 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees indoors, 22 degrees, so more comfortable indoor temperature, we see something interesting. At this higher temperature, the air can hold a significantly higher amount of moisture, about 4 times in fact. And so even though our absolute humidity, or 30 grains per pound or 2 grams per kilogram, has not changed, the relative humidity has decreased to 25%. So still the same amount of water in the air, but the air can hold so much more now that the relative humidity has dropped. And we can actually go about plotting this example on a chart. And so if we have the bottom axis showing the temperature of the air and the vertical axis showing our absolute humidity, we can first draw the line corresponding to 100% relative humidity. And right here, you can see that as the temperature increases, the amount of moisture it takes to fully saturate the air, to fully hit that 100%, increases almost exponentially. And in fact, this line becomes perfectly vertical right at the boiling point, where some quite interesting things start to happen. So we can plot our point for the 35F, 2 degrees centigrade and 100%. We can then plot the same point for the 100% condition at the warmer indoor temperature. And here we can see that we would actually need about 120 grains or 8 grams per kilogram to fully saturate the air. And so we can draw another curve here corresponding to 25% relative humidity. And so there we've plotted our example. What we've started drawing here might start looking quite familiar to some of you that are involved on more of the design side. What we've actually started drawing here, of course, is the psychrometric chart. And this is quite a useful chart when we're talking about humidity, but also HVAC in general. Really just wanted to focus on highlighting how the humidity ties into that. Okay, so now that we know that, what causes the dryness inside our buildings? So let's take an example of a typical building. And here we have some ventilation that's going to be bringing in air from outside and a little bit of infiltration and exfiltration that will be exchanging air at the outside. We'll take a fairly cold wintertime condition, about 6 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 14 degrees centigrade, and kind of a mid-range humidity on this particular day, 53% relative humidity. If we use our psychrometric chart and we crunch the numbers on that, we'll see that that will correspond to an absolute humidity of 4 grains per pound or 0.6 grams per kilogram. When we bring that air inside the building, minus 14 obviously wouldn't be very suitable for an indoor environment. So we're going to heat that up with our heating equipment and bring that to a more comfortable inside air temperature of 70 degrees and 21 degrees centigrade. And what happens here is exactly what we saw in the first example with the controlled volume of air or the controlled mass of air, that because we're only adding heat when we bring it inside the building, our absolute humidity of 4 grains per pound carries across. And as a result, the relative humidity in the building drops to an incredibly low 4% relative humidity. Now, in a typical building, you'll have some moisture sources, whether it's from people in the space or processes in the space. If you're talking about your home, you'll have some humidity generated by activities such as washing and cooking. Similarly, an office environment would typically have some moisture generated by coffee pots and people washing hands in the community kitchen, things like that. But nonetheless, you're not going to get a whole lot much higher than that. It's quite common here in Canada to see indoor relative humidities of 10 to 12%, 10 to 20% in the middle of the winter time, which is extremely low and almost desert-like conditions. Of course, so more or less to summarize this, the real problem that we're dealing with here is that when we have outside air with low absolute humidity and we bring that inside our buildings, we're going to have a drying effect. And in practical terms, what that means is really anytime the air temperature drops below 10 to 12 degrees centigrade, bringing in that outside air, we're going to have a significant drying effect on the building. In many locations in the country, this means that dryness actually becomes a bit of a seasonal problem. Certainly where I am here in Ottawa, Ontario, we're known for our cold winters and our warm, humid summers. And a load profile here or a humidity profile throughout the year would tend to show that through the cold months, the November through February is when we reach really peak dryness indoors. And conversely, in the summertime, we actually switch to more of a dampness situation where we get into commonly dehumidification as well, and have to bring some of that excess moisture out. So that's all fine and good, but is having a dry indoor environment actually a problem? Does it really matter if we're getting down to 10 or 12% relative humidity indoors in the wintertime? And we can answer this from several different points of view. First and foremost, I'll talk about what happens when we talk about processes or materials. And second of all, we can talk about it from an occupant health and wellness point of view. When we're talking about process and materials, we're really talking about three different things. The first and the one that you'll probably be most familiar with is what we'd call hygroscopic materials, or the image we have here in the middle. And hygroscopic materials are materials that absorb moisture from the environment and desorb moisture back into the environment, depending on whether the material has more moisture than the ambient environment or vice versa. Wood is probably the most common one that you'll encounter, but really any type of organic material, many types of foods, textiles would all fall into this category. And what tends to happen with these materials is when they're exposed to dampness, they'll absorb the moisture, and that will tend to drive a change in the structure of material. The moisture molecules are getting into the molecules of the material, and they're going to start pressing outwards. And this is where we get sort of dimensional changes that you might see with wood. If you've ever left a piece of wood in a puddle or it's gotten wet, you may notice the warping effect that can happen. Conversely, when materials like wood get too dry, they lose all their moisture, and then they're going to tend to shrink and lose a lot of their volume. And this can be problematic if we're talking about what practically for buildings. Hardwood floors are a common example that comes to mind. Many manufacturers of hardwood floors will invalidate the warranty below 30% relative humidity because they know that the floor will be prone to shrinking, and then you'll start getting the gaps and the creaks and the motion in the floor. So hygroscopic materials are something that we commonly discuss. Evaporation rates are another thing that's commonly discussed in more of a manufacturing or a process-based setting. But fundamentally, what's happening here is if you tried to apply a coating, and typically or specifically a water-based coating to a surface, the rate at which the coating is going to dry is driven largely by the ambient relative humidity. So if we were trying to paint something on a very, very foggy day where it's 100% relative humidity, you wouldn't expect that paint to dry very quickly. And in fact, it may dry too slowly and slide down the surface or fall off. Conversely, if you're trying to apply paint in a condition like we showed earlier with the 4% relative humidity inside the home, what you might find is that the paint dries too quickly on the surface, and then you get some cracking or deterioration of the paint as it dries. So a lot of those processes will be looking for a specific balance depending on what product is being applied. And certainly if you look at the back of paint cans and other coatings, you'll see that there's specifications for temperature and humidity at which the product is best applied. Static electricity is a final concern, and this is certainly something here in Canada you'd be familiar with in the wintertime, even just walking around your house or getting out of bed in the morning, the shower of sparks that come off the bed sheets. And really what's happening here is when the relative humidity is higher, the moisture molecules in the air are providing a path for electricity to dissipate through the air. When we get to very dry environments, there aren't those molecules to allow the electricity to move around more freely. And so the charge is going to build up and build up and build up until it reaches about 20 kilovolts or 20,000 volts, at which point you could have a small spark discharge. When you start seeing static in your house or in your office, that's a pretty good sign you're into a very dry environment at that point. Okay, so we talked a bit about the process side of things and the impact of humidity on various materials within the building, let's talk a little bit about what dry environments actually do to the people inside the building. First and foremost, it's important to keep in mind that the adult human body is about 60% made of water. And so right off the start here, you can see that the level of moisture in our bodies has a significant impact on our function and our makeup here. And so that'll give you a bit of a hint that dry environments may be a bit hazardous to that. One thing that's very interesting about the human body is that we have a very finely tuned sense of temperature, and we're able to detect very, very small changes in temperature, or even just holding your hand near a hot stove, for example, you can pick up some of the radiation off that stove and know that there's heat nearby. When it comes to the moisture in the environment, though, our body doesn't actually have a dedicated sensory mechanism for sensing it. We can often infer that we're in an environment that's too dry or too wet, based on some of the secondary effects it has on us. And I'll talk about those here in a little bit as we get into each of these. But the ambient moisture typically is going to have secondary effects, or effects that we can feel on our eyes, our skin, throat, nose, overall hydration, and ultimately our immune system. So let's get into those. First and foremost, our eyes. So the eyes themselves need to stay wet in order to function properly. They're protected by a thin tear film that covers them and is refreshed every time you blink. In a very dry environment, what's going to happen, though, is that tear film is going to dry out and desiccate very, very quickly. And this is actually significantly compounded by computer use, where the computer use, and especially some of the older style CRT ones, which are much, much less common these days, will tend to actually cause your body to slow down the blinking rate as you stare into the screen and the light. There was some research done back in the 1980s that was able to generate a chart showing that really anything below about 31% relative humidity at 68 degrees is going to start causing eye discomfort. And so they were able to plot a chart correlating temperature with minimum relative humidity for eye health. Typical symptoms you'd find of dry eyes include discomfort, redness, and photosensitivity, where it becomes kind of painful to either stare at your screen or look at the lights. Skin is another really important one to talk about. And our skin is most relevant in this case because it's providing not only protection to us, but also regulating our body temperature, which needs to stay fairly constant. The body regulates its temperature using evaporation of water from the skin. So when we get very, very hot, the pores in our skin will open up. It'll let some of the water in our body out. And as that water evaporates, it's going to draw the energy that it needs for evaporating directly from our body and produce a cooling effect for us. You can feel this certainly much, much more if you get out of a swimming pool on a breezy day, for example, and you can really feel the energy being taken off of you as that water evaporates. What happens in dry and very damp environments is that this moisture balance gets disrupted. In very, very dry environments, even if your body doesn't want to cool down, the moisture is going to be drawn from your skin simply by the dry environment trying to acquire more moisture. So it's going to literally suck the moisture out of you. And what this is going to do is it's going to generate a sensation that you're cooler than it actually is. And practically, we can often see this in the winter where people are turning up the thermostats because they're feeling colder, even though the thermostat itself might say 21 or 22 degrees year round. Similarly, if you look at a very damp environment, the opposite happens in that the moisture that comes out of our skin has nowhere to go in the environment. And as a result, you don't get the cooling. And now you have a dampness that remains in your skin, and you get that really damp, sticky feeling of it. And it's hard to cool down. Below 30% relative humidity, we see another effect as well, where the skin can become dry. And people who suffer from eczema will certainly know about this, but as your skin becomes dry, it tends to become more cracked, and then there's more possibility of inflammation, aggravation of skin conditions, and new potential paths for pathogens to get into your skin and cause infections. The throat is another important part of the equation when we talk about humidity and dryness in buildings. Our throat is a key component in that it allows the air to enter our lungs. And it's also providing some conditioning to the air we breathe, bringing it up to the appropriate temperature, as well as a higher level of humidity, which optimizes the performance of your lungs. What happens though is that as you breathe in a lot of dry air, it's going to draw out more and more moisture. And unless we're constantly replenishing that moisture, you can find yourself and your throat asking for more. And what will tend to happen here is that you'll have an increased need to continually swallow. You'll find your vocal cords start to dry out and becomes harder to talk. And this can be a problem if you're working in a role or you have employees in a role where where having to talk for long periods of time or be on the phone a lot is very important. And these dry environments can have really negative effects on the vocal cords and your throat. In the US, the National Institute of Health, the NIH, recommends maintaining indoor relative humidity above 30% and drinking lots of water. And that was as part of one of their publications on taking care of your voice and really targeted at people that are in speaking roles. Hydration is another important area, and this is an area that's only really starting to be explored in science in the more recent years. But some of the interesting things we've learned here is that even though your body is 60% water, your brain has actually much higher water content, about 85%. And when we're involved in the dry environments, when you're present in a dry environment, you're going to find that you're starting to lose water to the environment more quickly, and that'll start to bring down the overall amount of water in your body. And one of the interesting things that came out of a study was that the cognitive function, or your ability to focus and really work at peak performance, starts to decrease even at about 2% dehydration. With side effects of reduced short-term memory, increased levels of fatigue, moodiness among people that were studied. And what's particularly interesting about this is 2% dehydration is not at the threshold yet where you'll start to feel thirsty. So some of these effects will start taking place before you hit the level where your body says, oh, shoot, I need to replenish the amount of water. Some good resources have come out in recent years and some good studies on this as well. There was one that was done in Germany back in 2014, looking at air humidity in the office workplace. This was really drawn out of occupant surveys where they were trying to resolve the complaint that I feel the air is often too dry. And so they did a really interesting study here where they used just the office environment as it was. They applied an active humidifier to bring up the level of humidity, and they applied a placebo humidifier here as well. And the results of this one showed pretty clearly that controlling the humidity and bringing it up from these very dry environments to a more moderate range had quite some significant benefits. And a lot of the things we've just talked about: reduced eye strain, reduced vocal strain. They noted some reduced impacts of allergies and asthma, increased employee performance based on their surveys, and an increased overall comfort level at that moderate range. And one of the key takeaways from this one was maintaining that mid-range, or maintaining a more moderate humidity in the workplace, can be used as a building block for increasing both personal well-being and possibly reducing health risks. So what does ASHRAE and our building code say about all this? In ASHRAE, there is a chart that's been used for many, many years, and it's called the Sterling chart. It was published first in the mid-1980s. And the work there that was done by Dr. Sterling really showed the optimal benefit for people in about a mid-range, about 40 to 60% relative humidity. Over the years, ASHRAE committees also added on the 30 to 40% range here as a recommendation. And that was particularly understanding that it may not always be possible, especially in very cold climates, to reach that 40% ideal level. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we come to some of the more practical sides of humidity control. ASHRAE standard 55 is referenced by a number of codes. And unfortunately, it doesn't actually establish any sort of limits on dryness. The exact quote there is, "There are no established lower humidity limits for thermal comfort. Consequently, this study does not specify a minimum level." But then they have a note here at the bottom that highlights what we've just talked about with skin dryness, dryness of eyes, static electricity, and kind of leave it up to the designer to make their own best judgment. ASHRAE also did a research project quite recently. This one was done in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, that was really looking at updating and refreshing our knowledge on the applicability or the safety or suitability of very dry environments for people. And they looked at a number of articles focusing on comfort, health, indoor environmental quality, and ultimately came up with very much what was shown originally in the Sterling chart, that mid-range, that 40 to 60% had a lot of benefits for the topics we just discussed, as well as they touched a little bit on viruses. And that point on the viral survival here is quite interesting, and it's something that we're going to explore here in more detail. Historically, we've always thought of humidity as sort of a comfort case. You certainly won't die from being in a very dry environment if your eyes are a bit irritated or you feel a bit colder. But a lot of the research that's come out now is really suggesting that humidity goes much beyond that, and really there are strong links between the humidity in the air and the health and well-being of the occupants in the buildings. Historically, there was some evidence of links between the moisture levels in the environment and the prevalence of cold and flu viruses transmitting in the buildings. And there were some studies that were initially done between the 1960s and the 1980s that showed reduction of respiratory infections, your cold, your flu, when we're able to maintain a mid or a more moderate range of relative humidity. The CDC did a similar study on this in the right around the turn of the millennium, and that continued through 2015, 2016, looking for really the peak months of when influenza was most active in the United States. And what they found here was that when we see people, of course, going inside because it becomes cold outside, we see a much higher rate of influenza. But the months that we're showing here also actually correlate with the time of peak dryness in the spaces. And so they had several theories as to why influenza tends to be more of a fall and wintertime issue. Of course, more people spending more time indoors in close proximity to others, drying of the nasal mucous membranes, so your nose has weakening effects on the respiratory system. The influenza virus they found to be more stable at lower relative humidities, and the aerosols that are being exhaled have a propensity of staying around much longer in dry environments. So we can dig into these points a little bit more with some additional research that was done much more recently. When we talk about stability of viruses and how they can live longer in dry environments, a commonly cited source is a 2010 study that was looking at the first SARS coronavirus outbreak, one that thankfully didn't go on as long as the one that we're currently facing. But they discovered here that as a result of several factors, that viruses tend to prefer very dry environments and very damp environments. And part of the reason for this is the particles that they're entrained in, or when they're coughed out and sent into the room, contain a high amount of water. And if the water dries up very, very quickly, it will form a little protective salt covering for the virus and allow it to become protected as it floats around the space. And something similar was happening at the very high levels, is that we never really saw that drying effect. And so as a result, the larger water bubble maintained the salt concentration at a nice, comfortable place for the virus. But that mid-range moisture had really an optimal position for the droplets to dry out and end up in a place where they had a much lower survival rate. The other part that's interesting to know is that when the particles are expelled from people, or people cough out the viruses, what tends to happen is these particles will travel a distance and settle out on the floor. And the rate of settling is driven by how heavy or how large the viral particles are. And what will happen in dry environments is the particles that get coughed out will very, very quickly lose a lot of their moisture mass. And so instead of being nice and heavy and falling to the floor, they'll actually become much, much lighter and much smaller, in addition to having those protective salts forming around the virus. And then they will remain floating around in the environment for a long amount of time. And this study actually found that the very small and very light particles at the range of about half a nanometer could remain floating around and viable in the environment for up to about 41 hours, which is pretty significant. And when you start adding up these factors, we can pretty clearly see why people are getting sick when they get indoors, and how some of the conditions in the building can really have an impact on the likelihood of others getting sick. A lot of this research was bolstered by a study done starting in 2012, where they were looking at hospital research. And the main thing they were trying to understand with this hospital was, we've gotten really good at hygiene. We believe we're getting pretty good at sanitizing things and making things nice and clean. But when you look at hospitals in general, the rate of healthcare acquired infections, or the number of people that get sick from going into the hospital, really haven't improved a whole lot. And so they were trying to understand, okay, well, if it's not washing your hands and spraying sanitizer, why are people still getting sick indoors? And so the building they used was a LEED silver building, and the analysis they did was really focused on kind of the whole microbiome. They were looking to try and understand what was going on in the hospital at both a macro level as well as a micro level, looking right down to the types of bacteria and the types of microbes that they were encountering. They did a 3-layer study over 13 months in 10 patient rooms, where they saw about 300 patients go through. And they were continuously monitoring a number of parameters. So air changes per hour, number of people coming in and out, how much outside air was being brought into the room, pressure, temperature, absolute and relative humidity, carbon dioxide, air pressure, and light. And they collected about 8 million data points at the end of that. And they had some interesting results. Firstly, 15% of the people that came into those rooms contracted a healthcare acquired infection, and not a great result, of course. That's about 1 in 6, or just a little bit less than that. So why was this happening? And after crunching all their different parameters and looking for a parameter that correlated, curiously, they only found one that had a strong relationship between the healthcare acquired infections and the indoor environment. And given that this is a presentation on humidity, I'm sure you can guess that it turned out to be relative humidity. And what they discovered in this building was that as the relative humidity dropped in the winter months, or December, February, March, April, that the number of healthcare acquired infections went up. And as the relative humidity raised in the warmer and more humid summer months, the number of healthcare acquired infections went down. And the study had a very, very high confidence level in this result. It's with a confidence level of less than 0.02. So a pretty strong correlation they observed here. This research was repeated in a different setting, or in a similar research was repeated in a different setting in 2018, looking at a school. And what they wanted to do here was build on the hypothesis that, well, based on what we saw in the hospital, what if we took the relative humidity from a very dry classroom and we brought it up? Would we see better outcomes in a school situation? And so they focused on the preschool on several preschool classrooms in the Midwest United States. They did air and toy samples where they processed with PCR tests looking for the presence of influenza A. And they compared standard or control rooms with rooms where humidity control was later added. And what they found was actually quite striking, that in the very dry rooms, the control rooms where there was no humidity control, they observed about 2.3 times as many influenza-like illnesses in those rooms. And so, a significant number more children ended up getting sick and absent with influenza. And this study was really one of the first that suggested that controlling the humidity to a moderate range could be a way that we can control viral spread without pharmaceuticals. The research kept going and has actually built quite a lot of steam since then. A 2019 study really did a deep dive on the human body using mice as kind of surrogates for us because of some of their similarities in tissues. And really what they looked at was attempting to deliberately infect mice with influenza in different environmental conditions. And then once the mice were infected, see what the outcomes were in those different conditions as well. And what they discovered here really strengthens what was seen in some of the earlier studies, that in the lower humidity environments, the mice were actually much more likely to get sick, and not just because of the particles floating around, but also because the dry environments were having a negative impact on their immune system. And in this study, they were actually able to identify that the mucous membranes, the lung tissue function, and the cilia, which are inside your body and focus on removing invasive particles, all of those functions were significantly impaired in the dry environments. The mucus was drying out too quickly, the cilia was having trouble moving the mucus around, and the lung tissues, as a result of drying, were more susceptible to allowing those viral particles to penetrate deep and form an infection. And so these results show that really the exposure to dry air was impairing the body's ability to fight infections. And they also noted that it took longer in the dry environments for the drier tissues to repair themselves. And so the recovery times tended to be longer and the outcomes were much, much worse. So one of the things to summarize all of this is it's really time to rethink how we're building our buildings and building our indoor environments. We know from the history, and we know from a lot of research that was done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that we can't have buildings that are too wet. When buildings are too wet with very high relative humidity, we have a lot of active water, available water for molds to grow, and we can have moldy buildings and a lot of problems with that. We thought that the solution to this was to keep the buildings as dry as possible, and eliminate any of the moisture for that. But what we're actually learning is that while that may may eliminate the risk of mold, it's really having a negative effect on the occupants in these buildings. And where we really need to be is somewhere right in the middle of that, the mid-range humidity that supports the health of the occupants. And there is some good news here. One of the things that has silver linings, I guess, of the current COVID situation has been there has been a lot of increased focus on researching buildings and building better buildings going forward and healthier indoor environments. And we're starting to see the first of this guidance come out, and a lot of this will ultimately make its way into building codes in the coming years. But there's two new Government of Canada papers that came out focusing on reducing transmission of COVID-19 in long-term care homes, and even in the personal homes as well. And both of them said the same thing, recommending a mid-range between 30 and 50% indoor relative humidity in indoor settings. Talking practically, how do we know that our indoor environments are healthy for us? And there's really kind of a trifecta of three important components that we want to look at when we're designing buildings and when we're operating buildings or even retrofitting buildings to be healthier. And that is the temperature, the relative humidity, and the carbon dioxide levels. Temperature, the optimal of 20 to 23 minimizes the thermal stress on the people in the building and promotes comfort and happier people in the space. Relative humidity, we've just talked a bit about, or we've talked quite a bit about so far, maintaining that mid-range, 40 to 60%, down to 30% if we need to in very cold climates. Which has benefits for the health of the people, their immune system, reducing the amount of infectious particles in the space. And carbon dioxide can also be brought in there. Carbon dioxide is commonly used right now as a measure of how fresh the air in a building is. But it turns out that we can actually use carbon dioxide as a bit of a rough estimate for the number of particles that are exhaled in the space, or the number of potentially infectious particles that are out there. And the way that this works is that in the ambient environment, the baseline level of carbon dioxide is about 400 parts per million. The human body will exhale about 40,000 parts per million of CO2 in a breath. And if your room carbon dioxide increases from 400 to 800 parts per million, so an increase of 400 parts per million, that basically means that you're breathing in 1% of somebody else's exhaled air. And, is 1% bad? Well, we don't really know, but you can think of it almost as a speed limit on a highway, that the higher that value goes, from 1,000 to 2,000, 3,000 and up, that you're breathing in increased amounts of air that's been exhaled by other people, and thus you're greatly increasing the risk that you might get sick or pick up some of those particles. So an optimal level is somewhere in the range about 800 to 1,000 from what we're starting to see. Just as an aside, I had a colleague in Europe that took some of this out into the field to take a look at how this would actually translate to a commercial flight. Airport, we saw a lot of green values here, with those three parameters being measured measured in the airport, all within the values I showed on the previous slide. But some interesting things happened in flight, of course. On the ground, while people are boarding the aircraft, there's not a whole lot of activity going on in the HVAC system, and most of the air is actually just being recirculated. And you can see immediately here that the CO2 level spiked to about 3,200 parts per million. So there is a significant amount of air exchange between the occupants on the plane in this particular case, as well as temperature rising quite quickly here. In flight, once the engines are on and the air is circulating around the plane and outside air is being brought in by the engines, things were much better, and you're in a much safer place. But then you see the values spike up again as the engines throttle down and the plane comes to land. So interesting kind of anecdote, but if you think about how this might apply to your buildings, depending on how you're operating the ventilation systems and bringing in the outside air, you might actually be encountering similar effects as what was observed on this flight, as an example. So to summarize, where do we want the humidity targets for our spaces? When we're talking about processes, that'll really depend highly on the process. But when we're talking about people, we really want to have that in a moderate mid-range, 40 to 60%, down as low as 30% in very cold or very dry environments. Okay, we'll spend the last 4 to 5 minutes here focusing on some of the practical humidity control aspects, and how do we actually go about providing that mid-range humidity in an efficient way. First thing to know about controlling humidity and adding moisture to the air in dry environments is that energy is required. In order for the liquid water that we have to become water vapor in the air, it needs to undergo a phase change process of evaporation. And as a result of that, there is energy that drives that phase change process. Works out to be about 1,000 BTUs per pound, or about 2,400 kilojoules per kilogram, depending on the temperature of the water. If you're using a humidification device that produces steam, for example, that energy is going to come from a primary energy source, electricity, gas, or a heat exchange process. If you're using a moisture addition device that either sprays or evaporates the water into the air, the same amount of energy is still required. But what's going to happen now is that you're going to take that energy directly from the air. And so the air itself is going to become cooler in addition to more humid. But no matter how we get there, there is a level of energy required. So how do we keep that amount of energy under control? Well, one thing to know in dry environments is that the amount of moisture we need to add to the building is directly proportional to the amount of air from outside that we're bringing in and heating up. So controlling the amount of airflow and using an optimized value is kind of your first way that you can control some of the energy usage here. And that's also a way that we control energy usage on heating and cooling loads as well. One thing to be careful with, some of the LEED standards and some of the high performance building standards will reward very high air changes per hour. And a lot of operation strategies might look at using economizer type systems in the spring and fall that can bring in cool outside air and cool the buildings. But what that's going to do is it's going to drive indoor dryness and can require additional energy to bring the moisture level back up. The other thing that's quite common is using a set point down towards the lower range of the optimal, so 40 to 45% relative humidity. This is giving us a good margin of safety on the too high or too damp condition, while also minimizing the amount of moisture that needs to be added. Total energy or enthalpy recovery devices are also very useful. In addition to recovering heat from the building, they're also recovering the water back into it as well. I've seen some studies that show that they can recover as much as 70% of the moisture. So that has a great reduction in the amount of humidity energy that needs to be added. And in some climates can even reduce dehumidification loads as well. And I mentioned economizers. Be careful with the high air changes and bringing in the moisture. Best practice here is to look for total enthalpy and not just focus on the temperature. We talked a little bit about mold before. So what about mold? You know, will adding or bringing that moisture up to the mid-range of my building drive mold? And the answer is not necessarily. Mold growth requires water. And the way we can look at that is through the water activity factor, which for our purposes here, if we leave a building or leave a material, for example, exposed to 60% relative humidity for long enough, we'll see that that water activity factor will level out at about 0.6. Most of the mold causing organisms require a water activity factor of about 0.7. So a higher level, getting up to kind of a prolonged exposure to 70% relative humidity and above. They also require a nutrient-rich substrate, something for them to eat, although they don't seem to have any problem eating drywall. So that, you know, is something to be aware of. But what we're really trying to do is avoid places in the building where we'll see localized high levels of relative humidity that are far above that 60% and above that 70%. What this tends to mean is sealing up the buildings as best as possible, to look for air leaks, cold pipes that are dripping, things like that. But most importantly, when we're talking about adding humidity to the building, we really want to avoid condensation. Condensation will happen whenever the humid air inside a building interacts with something that is cooler than the dew point. And that's going to start drawing the moisture out of the air and causing it to condense as a liquid water. Most of the time, our worst cases in buildings is going to be the windows and doors, which will have the lowest insulation value. Lower insulation in exterior walls can also be problematic. and pipes that are transporting cool or chilled substances through the space. So in very, very cold climates, we recognize that we can't always reach the 40 to 60% relative humidity. And so it's very common in this that we'll throttle the humidifiers back on very cold days down to about 30% relative humidity to keep the air at a condition where it won't be going below the dew point and where we won't have windows and doors below the dew point. Some of the ways that this can be controlled are devices like condensation sensors, but there's also common strategies that we use to avoid condensation on windows and doors. And that includes ventilating or providing heat for the glass, and really focusing on quality in construction and the vapor barriers, being careful that we're not damaging vapor barriers during buildup, and that we're focusing on building tight and well insulated buildings. There's some really good resources available for building walls that can handle humidity, written by Joe Burek. He writes a column in the ASHRAE Journal, and if you haven't read it, it's both entertaining and informative. So it's quite a useful resource. So to wrap everything up and summarize, we covered really 5 main topics to know here today. First and foremost, building dryness occurs when the outside is drier than our target levels indoors. So whenever the absolute humidity outside is low, we'll have a drying effect. When we're bringing in lots of outside dry air, that'll have a drying effect. But typically we're going to see that in the winter seasons when the air becomes very cold. We talked about humidity and how it affects processes and materials. We talked about static electricity. We talked about hygroscopic materials, and we talked about drying and evaporation within processes. Humidity has significant effects on the occupants in the building too. We talked about some of the indirect effects you can feel with your mouth, your nose, your eyes, skin. But we spent a lot of time talking about the important and the latest research that humidity actually has a significant impact on the health of the occupants. Dry environments will tend to promote more infectious particles lingering around for longer, while making your body more susceptible to it. And really, the key here is an optimal set of indoor conditions. That's a mid-range humidity, 40 to 60% relative humidity. Comfortable indoor temperature, 20 to 23 degrees centigrade, 68 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and ensuring that there's enough fresh air brought in, that we're controlling the indoor CO2 below 1,000 parts per million, where we are reducing the amount of air exchange between the different occupants in the space. And then finally, we talked about some of the ways that you can plan on achieving mid-range humidity while achieving great results and minimizing energy usage. If you're interested in learning any more about the topic, there's kind of 3 great resources that are available. The first, I mentioned that I'm part of a technical committee within ASHRAE on the humidification side. The next meeting will be at the winter conference coming up in January 2022. Apologize for the typo there. The ASHRAE meetings going forward are going to be a combination of in-person and hybrid. So even if you're not able to make it down to the conference, you're more than welcome to join us via the web. ASHRAE has several great resources available on their bookstore as well. I've listed a few of these here. These were previous presentations that have been done at their conferences. The System and Equipment Chapter 22 in the ASHRAE Handbook goes into a lot more detail than I covered here today, in particular on different technologies that can be applied to maintain mid-range relative humidity. And as well, HRAI's sister organization, AHRI, has several free education resources available on their website. You can find those under ahrinet.org/humidifiers. And there's some past recordings and similar slides to this that have been done in the past if you wanted to learn more or share that around. And so with that, I think we have come to the end of our presentation, and I think we have a few minutes for question and answer at this point.
Nicholas, yes, we do have 5 minutes. I have a couple of questions here. One of them is, we mostly build to code. Do you foresee code changing to require specific humidity levels?
I do. And I think as I showed on one of the earlier slides, where we saw some of the new guidance from the Government of Canada and Health Canada really highlighting that mid-range, as well as a lot of the new research that's come out, and some of which I've showed here today, that will work its way into the code cycles. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 1 to 2 code cycles, which corresponds to about 5 to 10 years, that we start seeing limits for humidity and potentially even their way into code.
Okay, then another one is that in Southern Ontario, it can get quite humid even in the winter. So is humidity control still needed?
Yeah, and really, even though it may be quite humid in the winter, so say you have a cold a day where it's -5, but 85% relative humidity out. Even though that 85% relative humidity is quite humid outdoors, once you bring that air inside the building, as we saw in the earlier example, and heat it up, that 85% is going to drop quite significantly. And you will still have a need for adding moisture to bring us up to that mid-range. Probably not as significant of a need as what you might find in, say, Calgary, where it can be cooler and drier and a higher elevation as well. But there would still typically be a need.
Thank you. Last question. It seems there is a lot of research on humidity. Is there more being done?
Yeah, there's quite a bit being worked on right now. I know there is several projects that are currently focusing on extending some of the microbiome work that's been done. The kindergarten research, there's several follow-ups to that planned as well. And there is quite a big focus right now on indoor health and indoor air humidity. I actually saw a really interesting preprint come across my desk yesterday from the University of Oregon, where they did some direct research, putting people that were actually sick with COVID-19 into a chamber and having them deliberately cough or go about their day for several hours. And they were actually able to map where the particles ended up at a variety of different conditions, with temperature and humidity and fresh air rates. And the results from that study, or at least the preprint results from that, really solidify what we saw here earlier, and really suggest that what we've been talking about during this presentation would also quite apply quite well to the current pandemic situation, and COVID-19 in particular.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nicholas. So this ends our presentation today. I hope our members found this informative. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to HRAI. Additionally, please complete the evaluation survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the session. And with that, have a great afternoon, everyone. And thanks again, Nicholas.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Bye.